It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture, the 21st annual Nigel Walker lecture, and we're delighted that so many people have been able to join us this afternoon. I want to just say a word of introduction and then introduce Manuel, who will talk for 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A, questions and observations, and then everybody is very warmly welcome to stay for a reception which will be in the area outside this seminar room. Well, who was Nigel Walker? Some of you will know, of course, but others may not know who he was. Nigel Walker was a key figure in the development of the discipline of criminology in Britain, and unusually perhaps he came to criminology in his mid-40s from a civil service background. He'd graduated from Christ Church, Oxford, with a degree in philosophy and ancient history, and after Second World War service in the Camerons and Lovat Scouts, a crack skiing intelligence group between 1940 and 1946. From 1946 to 1961, he became a civil servant in the Scottish office, and for the latter part of his time there, he was in the department responsible for criminal justice policy. Well, in 1958, Nigel Walker won a one-year research fellowship for civil servants at Nuffield College in Oxford, and during that year he conducted a questionnaire-based study, later published as Morale in the Civil Service, published in 1961. I think he got a taste for empirical research and certainly research more generally. Serendipitously, soon afterwards, Max Grumhut, Oxford's first reader in criminology, retired. And despite the fact, as he wrote in his autobiography, A Man Without Loyalties, which was published in 2003, Nigel then knew no academic criminology, self-claimed. But he was bold enough to apply, and the Oxford Centre for Criminological Research was adventurous enough to give him the post, to the great benefit of the discipline. He was a very effective teacher. He demanded precision and concision. Thus, certainly in my day as an MPhil student in the Institute of Criminology in the early 1980s, if you observed him fiddling with his hearing aid, it wasn't so that he could hear you better. He might well have been switching off unless one was precise and concise. We learned very quickly. His student textbook, Crime and Punishment in Britain, became a standard work. In 1968, he published Volume 1 of Crime and Insanity in England, in which he examined how the law in England had dealt with offenders with mental health disorders from Saxon time onwards. It's a great work. Volume 2 followed in 1973, which he co-authored with Sarah McKay. This involved a follow-up study of some 1,200 offenders committed to hospital by the courts. Well, in 1973, Sir Leon Radzinovich retired from what was then the only established chair in criminology in the UK, the Wolfson Chair in Criminology. He also became director of the Institute from its inception, really, from 1959. Nigel Walker's, that's Sir Leon Radzinovich, Nigel Walker also became director. His research work focused on sentencing and penal theories. In his several books on sentencing, one or two stand out. Sentencing itself, published in 1985, the second edition published with our friend and colleague from law, Nicky Padfield. That was published in 1985. Why Punish, published in 1991, is notable for standing out against retribution. And there followed other volumes too, Aggravation, Mitigation and Mercy in English Criminal Justice, published in 1999, also a very important text. So that's Nigel Walker. Who is Manuel Eisner? Well, we welcome Manuel to give this lecture, not only as this year's speaker for the Nigel Walker Lecture, but indeed as the fourth Wolfson Professor. Was Professor Radzinovich, the founder of the Institute, who became Wolfson Professor in 1960, then Professor Walker, then Professor Bottoms, and then following Professor Bottoms' retirement, he was succeeded by Professor Lawrence Sherman from 2006 until earlier this year. So this is Professor Eisner's inaugural lecture as Wolfson Professor, as well as being the 21st Nigel Walker lecture. The first Nigel Walker lecture was in 1997, and the series was established to recognise the importance of and the insights which Nigel Walker brought to the philosophy of punishment. And it was under Professor Sir Anthony Bottom's directorship that we were fortunate to recruit as honorary Professor of Penal Theory and Penal Law one of the foremost philosophers of punishment, Andreas von Hirsch, who helped us by creating the Centre for Penal Theory and Penal Ethics, which Sir Anthony Bottoms is continuing with colleagues. The Nigel Walker lecture was created to give further recognition to this strand of work in particular. Over the years, it has broadened to encompass criminology of all kinds. Manuel Eisner came to the Institute of Criminology in 2001 for what I think he thought would be a fairly short period, maybe a year or two. He'd previously been assistant professor at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, an historian and sociologist by training. Manuel has produced amazingly interesting and insightful work on the history of violence in Europe, especially in regard to the long-term change in levels of homicide and its explanation. He's a principal investigator on the Zurich study on the social development of children, an ongoing longitudinal study of some 1,400 children born between 1997 and 1998. And work emerging from this study has examined the link between trustworthy and aggressiveness, the effects of early childcare on externalising behaviour, aggressive behaviour, and indeed the development of sex differences in aggression, amongst other things. Manuel also leads the Evidence for Better Lives study, which is an innovative global birth cohort study in 8 cities across the world. I think more generally, Manuel is active in promoting evidence-based violence prevention programmes in the UK, elsewhere in Europe, and indeed internationally. And he takes a very keen interest in the methodological quality of reporting on trial outcomes, the reporting of research. He was recipient of the Selling-Gluck Award from the American Society of Criminology in 2011, and in 2011, and in 2017 he was awarded the European Society of Criminology Award in recognition of lifetime contribution to European criminology. It's a funny thing, a lifetime award. We know there is more to come. There have been other prizes and honours too, but Manuel, thank you so much for agreeing to give this annual lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to give this Nigel Walker lecture to you today. I will start with the Rio Plus 20 summit in June 2012. Which was the beginning of the process that led eventually to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, which will frame the talk that I will be talking about today. At this summit in Rio in June 2012, the United Nations decided to commit governments to new Sustainable Development Goals, which would follow the so-called Millennium Development Goals, which were a set of 8 goals that included several goals, including, for instance, reducing global levels of poverty by half in the period between 2000 and 2015. The new goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, were developed in an extensive consultation process with civil society actors, with governments, and with representative of different interest groups. And eventually they led, on the 25th of September 2015, to the adoption of 17 new Sustainable Development Goals, which altogether were designed to develop a comprehensive development agenda, to end poverty, protect the planet, ensure prosperity in the period between 2015 and 2030. I should say here maybe to some of you in this audience that these Sustainable Development Goals have some very, very important implications for the research environment within which we are working. As you may know, the British government has dedicated £1.4 billion to research linked to the Sustainable Development Goals as the Global Challenges Research Fund. And in the university, there is a network of over 200 researchers that work within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, trying to work across disciplines together. Now, within these Sustainable Development Goals, there is a series of goals and targets that are directly relevant for criminology. You could say that without the involvement of criminologists, at least to my knowledge, the Sustainable Development Goals created a framework, a global framework, for doing work that has implications on crime and especially relating to violence. There was a wide consensus across different goals that reducing violence and creating more peaceful societies was one of the very important requirements for sustainable societies in the 21st century. I want to show you just 4 of the targets that directly are relevant for violence reduction. So the structure of the Sustainable Development Goals is that you have 17 goals. Within these goals, you have 169 more specific targets. And these targets are then further subdivided into indicators, measurable quantities that are set, that should be achieved over this 15-year period. Under Goal 4, for example, which is quality education, one target says provide safe, non-violent, inclusive and effective learning environments for all. Under Goal 5, gender equality, there is the target eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. And then there is Target 16, which is about peace and justice. And Target 16.1 is significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. And 16.2 relates to ending abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence and torture against children. Just a brief footnote here. When you read the language of these goals, we can easily agree that we're not going to achieve these goals by 2030. But irrespective of the language that these goals are written in, I think it's very important to realize that they, for the first time ever in human history, say, well, there is something that we believe can be done and on a global level to reduce violent levels of violence quite substantively. Just for goal 16.2, I want to illustrate to you how this is then translated into indicators. For instance, there are two indicators here to end, under the rubric ending abuse and violence against children. So the percentage of children aged 1 to 17 years who experienced physical punishment or psychological aggression in the past month would be an indicator that would be used to measure success along this target. Or the percentage of young women and men aged 18 to 29 years who experienced sexual violence by the age of 18. So you can see here, just to show you how this is then translated within quite large networks of specialists working at United Nations agencies into targets that they believe they can measure and hold governments to account for what they have been doing to achieve these goals. Now, in order to understand what these goals mean, it's important to get an idea of what the size of the problem is. And so I'm showing you just a selection of important figures here. Each year globally there are roughly 430,000 homicides per year, and it's important to understand here that when it comes to violent deaths related to intentional infliction of injury, they are by far the most important category of violent death. The more people die from homicide than people die from war these days. In some societies, like Brazil, interpersonal homicide is a major cause of death. Does anybody have an idea how many people have died in Brazil since the turn of the millennium, since 2000? It's 800,000 people. But we now have also figures for other types of violence. Roughly, based on a large systematic review, roughly 30% of women aged 15 and over have experienced physical and or sexual intimate partner violence globally. And about 54% of children, that's a result of a very recent systematic review under age 18, have experienced violence in the past year. Now, one of the ways to illustrate the size of this problem is to translate these figures into absolute numbers. And here you can see that we're talking about roughly 1 billion, that's the figure that the WHO currently uses, 1 billion children each year that are exposed to some type of violence. And the goal is try to reduce this over the next 15 years. I want to show you two more bits of information that give you a sense of why this is such a core goal or target within the Sustainable Development Goals. There is now a lot of research on the consequences of violent victimization, and it's now very clear that violent victimization has a very broad range of negative consequences, not just in terms of the direct physical harm that violent victimization does, but on a number of psychological, mental, physical, somatic consequences. Some people have tried to estimate the economic costs of violent victimization. These are tricky exercises, and nobody really knows how to do this well. But I want to show you one estimate by Anke Höfler from the University of Oxford, who has done this estimate based on various models for the Copenhagen Consensus Group. And she comes up with the notion that roughly the total costs of all types of interpersonal violence amount to something like 11% of global GDP. I'm not sure whether we should believe exactly this figure. Others have come up with other figures, but all of them result on very big numbers. Here you can see that this would be roughly equal to 4 times the total annual GDP in the United Kingdom. Because there has been a lot of work over the last 15 years, momentum has been building in terms of collecting data. I will talk about this in a minute. We now also know a lot about regional differences in exposure to violence. And I just want to show you 2 graphs to give you a sense of where the problem is. This is a graph of the worldwide distribution of homicide rates. And you can see here, although I think probably the colors just underestimate, don't give you a real sense of how big the differences are. They give you a sense of the regional distribution of lethal violence, and you can see that Latin America, Central America, and Africa have the highest rates of interpersonal lethal violence, while Europe emerges here as a wide spot of very low homicide rates. Europe is an exception to the general rule of relatively high frequency of lethal violence. Generally, you see that low and middle income countries are more exposed to interpersonal violence than high income countries. And that's also, for instance, what is found in a recent report published last year by the No Violence in Childhood initiative, which has put together data on sexual violence against adolescent girls, just as an example. And again, here you see how much industrialized societies, children growing up in industrialized societies, are protected from the kinds of violence that children across the world experience, with again very high levels in certain areas in Africa, but here also South Asia and East Asia. So what kind of progress has been has been made towards achieving these sustainable development goals? I just want to highlight 5 major areas where I think real momentum has been building over the last 15 years or so. There is a massive growth in available data. There are now major data sets that cover roughly 120 countries where there are victimization studies conducted, for instance, to measure female victimization, intimate partner violence, violence in schools, exposure to violence. They're usually general purpose questionnaires. For instance, for example, the Demographic and Health Questionnaire that has now been administered in 130 countries, which has a module that measures violence against women in low and middle income countries. Not least, one of the important consequences of this is that we now understand that if done well, these kind of questions can be asked. In countries like Pakistan, they can be asked. In countries like Bangladesh, if this is done well, and they yield important data that can be used again to hold governments to account and to assess progress along important goals. We have an increase in evaluation studies outside Europe and the United States. About 10 years ago, I would have said, well, there is almost no study, no randomized controlled trial, no evaluation study outside Europe and the United States that examines the effectiveness of violence prevention programs. That's changing very quickly. And there are now more and more studies conducted in low and middle income countries. There is developments of global information systems. And if you're interested in this, I really recommend to have a look at the Global Violence Prevention Information System, which is called Violence Info, developed by the World Health Organization, together with Mark Bellis, who is now the head of public health research in Wales, who used to be at at John Moore University in Liverpool, who's put up a huge online information system to understand violence prevention efforts. There's been a diffusion of a public health approach that tries to look at violence in a what's the problem, what's the cause, what works, how do you do it. And there is also global monitoring of violence prevention efforts. In 2014, Alex Butchart and Chris Micton, who is a student of ours, published the Global Status Report on Violence Prevention, which collected for the first time data on what governments across the world do to prevent violence and to intervene. And this report is being produced every 5 years, again with a view based, by the way, modeled on the success in traffic accident reduction, where the same instrument, namely making governments report on what they do, had a major effect on actually bringing governments to act on these lofty sustainable development goals. So I want to show you what is currently in the toolbox. Oh, the timer is no good if the light goes off. Right, good. So I just want to briefly show what's in the toolbox of these violence prevention strategies. And I want to show you one document that's quite important, the INSPIRE framework that has been developed by WHO and the US Centers for Disease Control to help governments achieve Target 62, namely ending abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against children. And it represents 7 strategies that are recommended to governments to act on, to implement, to reduce a significant reduction in violence against children. And just to give you a sense of where these recommendations currently are, I want to give you just examples under each of these labels. Implement laws that ban corporal punishment is one recommendation. Under norms and values, implement education and community mobilization programs against violence. Under safe environments, target hotspots and create safe built environments. Provide parent training programs of different types. Implement cash transfer programs under income and economic strengthening. Improve child protection services. And implement life and social skills training programs. These are the kinds of programs and approaches that are recommended by the WHO to help governments to achieve violence reduction goals. So this is fantastic, and I think INSPIRE is really genuinely inspiring, and it really changes the way people think. There is a major conference, just to give you an idea, there is a major conference in Manila where the entire child protection services in the Philippines come together just around this INSPIRE framework to discuss, well, what does this mean? How do we translate this into practice? How do we actually go about trying to realize these strategies? But the question is, are these the right strategies to actually achieve these population level goals? And the second question that I want to ask today is, are there research gaps? What kind of research do you need to provide further support? Now I want to make a first suggestion, and Lorraine already said that I'm a historian by heart, and I'm still a historian by heart, that hasn't changed. And so I want to make a movement to some kind of like macro level questions, and I will make an argument that we need to better understand the macro level processes that drive levels of violence. And the question, I think, is, do we think too much about programs? You know, we have all these different programs, and I'm sure they're important, I'm sure they matter. But the question is, do we need something else? Do we need to think about wider system change? And I want to illustrate this change with an example that keeps fascinating me. It's the example of a comparison between Venezuela and Singapore. Now, choosing Venezuela and Singapore as examples is informative from a violence perspective, because they're basically at the two polar ends of what you get in terms of homicide rates. And it's not necessarily all violence, but just in terms of homicide rates. Singapore is currently at about 0.25 per 100,000. That's about 5 times lower than the UK currently is, and Venezuela is currently at a rate of about 60. That's a massive difference. That's 1 to 300 difference. So this is really a big difference in that. Now, where does this come from? Now, some people might think, well, maybe this is just a general, more cohesive culture in Asian societies. Or some people may assume that there is some underlying personality structure that just makes Asian people more peaceful than people in Latin America. Maybe this is an old tradition of macho culture in Latin America. Now, one way to think about this is to ask, well, when did it actually start? And so I'm going to show you the trend in homicide rates in these two places. And look at this. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. Until about 1950, homicide rates in Venezuela and Singapore were not really that different. And then they start going into opposite directions. Now one of the next ideas that you might have, if you have some knowledge of Singapore, you might say, well, maybe that was because Singapore introduced the death penalty. And maybe it's because Singapore had such a strict control policy over chewing gums and so on and so forth. Now, I want to show you something else. And maybe in Venezuela things went wrong because of some policy that Venezuela adopted. Right? We tend to think about national policies being decisive in influencing national levels of violence. And that's why I'm going to show you trends in neighboring countries for Singapore, Hong Kong and Japan, and for Venezuela, Puerto Rico and Trinidad and Tobago. And look at that. That is also quite interesting. So the declining trend in Singapore was very much part. It looks a little. You're looking at me confused. It looks a little bit like magic. It does. It's just very, very surprising that in areas that are geographically close to each other, there seem to be very similar trends occurring. Now, what are possible explanations? I don't know what the answer is. Why did they go into different directions? But I want to give you just a few ideas. It could be related to drug policy and drug markets. Now, certainly in Singapore, I've tried to talk them into liberalizing their drug policies, and they were not quite convinced that this would be the right strategy for them. But there would be interesting questions to ask about whether the structure of drug markets in Latin America was different in such a way that it affected trends in homicide in Latin America in a different way from Southeast Asia. There could have been different trajectories in institutional legitimacy. So different trajectories in how policing was built up, how the criminal justice system was built up, in how the civil service was built up, which has resulted in overall quite accountable public services across East Asia, while in Latin America, corruption and lack of effectiveness, lack of efficiency are quite pervasive. It could have to do with differences in investment into human capital, especially, for instance, investment into self-control, education, and so on. Or it could have to do something which really doesn't really answer the question. I mean, none of these hypotheses answer the question. It could have to do something with an East Asian civilizing process. I don't know the answers, but I want to say a few things about what this means for research. There exist many examples of successful macro-level violence declines, but we need to better understand where they're coming from. And especially we need to better consider malleable factors, policing, diffusion of prevention policies, and so on, to better understand what drives these ups and downs of violence rates. So the second proposal that I want to come up with is that we need to get a better understanding of universal causal mechanisms that support aggression and or cooperation. So I think what I'm trying to say here that we need to move at the level underneath these different programs and try to understand what is the principle behind these programs, what is the mechanism that actually makes these programs work, if they do work. And I just want to illustrate this point with one topic that I'm quite interested in as a universe, what I believe is a universal mechanism, namely the revenge mechanism. Now, the idea here is that the desire for retaliation and revenge when being harmed is a human universal. All humans, especially male humans, want to hit back when they're being injured. And this mechanism, I believe, is an evolved mechanism that's deeply inside the functioning of our brains, especially, again, male brains. And it has evolved, for instance, to deter aggressors from acts of violence. It prevents attackers from attacking again. And it prevents egoistic actors from free riding. We can see this. I'm going to skip over this. We can see this mechanism functioning very nicely in very peaceful societies, like Switzerland, for instance, where we've asked the participants in the Zurich study on the social development of children who have been victims of harm doing, whether they think about killing somebody, right? So this is not actually killing somebody. This happens rarely in Switzerland, but thinking about killing somebody. So here is the result, how much victimization triggers retaliation fantasies. And this is for boys. It goes up from 3% to 70%. The more often you're victimized, the more often you think about killing somebody else. And this is for girls, it's less steep, but it also goes up quite substantially. So we can see this murder mechanism happening at the individual level. At the same time, I think, and that's about this link between micro and macro, I think we can see in Europe that over centuries, one of the reasons why homicide is low in Europe was because the revenge mechanism was gradually being brought under control through a state that not only enforced force but also became seen as legitimate. Now I can't help showing you these trends because so this is the trend in homicide rates in Europe over the past 800 years. And the reason why I show this to you partly is that I started at the beginning showing you that Europe is unique in the world with its low homicide rate. What this graph shows you is that this is not something that is just generally characteristic of Europe, but something that has happened historically over a process over several hundreds of years. We can only generalize very, very crudely about why this decline happened, but I just think that one of the plausible hypotheses is this Norbert Elias hypothesis, namely that this pacification of society and the control of private vengeance was due to the subordination of local warlords on the rulers who successfully asserted a monopoly of legitimate violence. Now I'm going to go through this because I have more things to say. So what I want to show here is that beyond all these different programs, we need to think about mechanisms that we believe are theoretically sound, that we can demonstrate they operate at the micro level, and try to understand how they translate into mechanisms as well at the macro level. A third topic that I want to address very briefly is the need to bridge the gap between law enforcement and criminal justice systems on the one hand and public health systems on the other hand. Over the last 5 or 10 years, I've mainly worked with representatives in the public health system. I've worked a lot with people in WHO and UNICEF, and one of the things that is really interesting is that in this world, the justice system does not exist, almost not exist. And especially if you go to countries like in Latin America, when it comes to violence prevention, yes, this is a good thing to do. When it comes to thinking about the role of the police or the criminal justice system, no, this is not what we want to think about when it comes to thinking about violence prevention. Partly as a result of the role that the police played historically, but partly also as a result just of the role that the police currently plays in many of these societies. But I think it's important to realize that the goal of reducing all forms of violence and other goals like equal access to justice, reducing corruption and bribery, and creating effective and accountable institutions, they belong together. And so I think we need to overcome this idea that prevention is nice and repression, control and punishment is bad, and bring these actors together. Why is this important? Because any violence prevention needs fair and effective enforcement of laws. You can't have, for instance, alcohol reduction policies without somebody eventually enforcing alcohol prevention policies. Law enforcement officers are often the first point of contact for the victims, and you need to have law enforcement officers who know how to understand how to deal with victims, for instance, of intimate partner violence or maltreated children. The state needs to provide protection, because if the state fails to do so, somebody else will, and that's what leads to the creation of gangs. And the criminal justice system, finally, is the most likely access point for interventions for violent and repeat offenders. And again, for reasons of time, I will skip some slides. I wanted to show you some examples, but just go to the research implications. I think it's important that we do more research that bridges the gap between police and criminal justice on the one hand and public health strategies. And I think that's especially important to do this in low-middle contexts, relating, for instance, in areas related to domestic violence, child maltreatment, substance abuse control, and so on. The fourth proposal is that we need to highlight limitations in our understanding where policy recommendations are based on a selective reading of the evidence. And I want to show this to you with something that I'm quite sure is close to the heart of all of us, namely early prevention. Here are a few statements on early prevention. The Allen report that many of you may remember says early prevention will have a positive effect on reducing crime and therefore must be at the heart of crime strategies. The US Interagency Working Group says we now know that the better and more cost-effective place to stop the cradle-to-prison pipeline is as close to the beginning of that pipeline as possible, and so on and so forth. So these are very strong statements. And the question is, how strong is our evidence really? I can't go into all the details, but I want to just highlight a few problems with this assumption. First of all, some childhood risk factors like difficult temperament, conduct problems, impulsivity and so on are not really causal risk factors. They are more what is called signs of heterotypic continuity. So they're different signs of the same phenomenon, just changing its face as children grow older. Some of these risk factors that have been identified in childhood may be markers of causal mechanisms that we don't really understand. Some, like poor parental monitoring, may be effects of child behavior rather than causes. And for almost all childhood risk factors, it's currently really unknown to what extent they are causal and malleable. And it's really unclear, finally, to what extent we can replicate these risk factors across studies and societies. Last year, it was actually the beginning of this year, Joe Murray, again, a student of ours who is now in Pelotas in Brazil and doing some fantastic work there, conducted the first ever systematic review on developmental risk factors for antisocial behavior and aggression in low and middle income countries. And he found, surprisingly, nobody would have expected this, 39 longitudinal studies in 18 low and middle income countries. So he puts together together with a group which included me, we put together everything that we could tease out of these longitudinal studies on early childhood risk factors. And it was an enormous amount of work. And I'm going to summarize the publication that is about 100 pages into 3 or 4 main findings. There were some expected findings. Early child problem behavior predicts later offending. That's not too surprising, really. Maternal depression across different societies, across different cultures, is predictive of later problem behaviors. That seems to be a very robust finding across many studies. But that's the 2 only developmental risk factors that we were able to establish with reasonable replicability across these different studies. And there were many surprises. Widely assumed early health factors had no or very small effect with antisocial behavior. That includes prenatal and postnatal malnutrition, tobacco and alcohol use in pregnancy, birth complications, brain injury, exposure to toxins, and we don't really understand why. Widely assumed social deprivation factors, poor educational achievement, large family size, low maternal education, family poverty. And it's just astonishing. I'm not showing this to you because I like these findings. I'm not showing this to you because I want to talk you out of early childhood prevention. I'm just showing this to you because this is what comes out of a synthesis of all these studies, and I think it's important to then talk about what are the implications and what do we need to learn before we draw premature conclusions. So at the moment, I think the conclusion that we are drawing from this is simply we do not have sufficiently valid knowledge about what the causally relevant early childhood risk factors are that we should target to reduce violence in these societies. So I come to the last 5 minutes, if that's still okay. And I want to use the last 5 minutes to show you a study that I'm currently working on, building up. I'm enthusiastic about it. And I want to briefly show you how we are trying to build up a new study that we think hope will address some of these questions that I've raised. We call it Evidence for Better Lives. It's a research consortium that includes academics from 13 universities across the world. It has 3 main components. We want to conduct an innovative child development study starting at birth in 8 different sites across the world. We want in this study to have a policy impact and component from the beginning to make sure that the knowledge that we generate is widely disseminated and influences national and international violence reduction policies. And we want to build a capacity building element into this study in that we want to promote young researchers to better understand how to translate their knowledge into prevention recommendations. Just very quickly, what are the sites? So these are the sites where we want to conduct this study. It includes Kingston in Jamaica, Kafaridwa in Ghana, Stellenbosch in South Africa, Cluj in Romania, Taulai Kalan in Pakistan, Ragama in Sri Lanka, Hue in Vietnam, and Valenzuela City in the Philippines. These are all medium-sized cities, and one of the interesting things research-wise here is that with these cities we have a lot of variation in social context conditions. So one of the things that we can do with this study is overcome the problem of linking individual level risk factors with macro level context risk factors, because we have much more variation in social context across these different sites. The consortium is an interdisciplinary group with 3 departments represented at the University of Cambridge: criminology, psychology and education. We have strong site teams with specialists from a number of different disciplines, and we have partnerships with WHO, the Global Partnership, UNICEF, and UNODC. Core features of the study are that we want to start a birth cohort study of 12,000 children born in 2020. That's the goal. We don't have the funding for this, by the way. Just to make this clear, we're working on it, but it's not there yet. We want to have the same methodology in all the sites, start in the last trimester of pregnancy, but design it in such a way that from the beginning we can continue the study in the long term. So ideally, if that works, we would have kind of like this global birth cohort study of an entire generation of children born in 2020 in different societies, and to try and better understand what is it that children in some societies grow up better and some not, and in what ways does exposure to violence affect their lives. We have the funding for this foundational study, and this foundational study is designed to just test just about everything that is relevant to move on to the main study. It starts, quite exciting, in 2 weeks' time, on the 1st of June, over 18 months. In this study, we want to conduct a comprehensive pilot of all the elements with 150 pregnant women per site. And we have a child protection policy summit in Manila where we invite all the mayors from all the cities to have this policy buy-in, to make sure that the mayors are involved in the process. I want to show you the thematic focus that we have in the pilot study. I think the big study would have to be much broader thematically, but for the pilot study, Asia Murray has just finished a fantastic paper that we have submitted on the intergenerational effects of exposure to intimate partner violence during pregnancy. In some of the sites in this study, for instance in Pakistan and Jamaica, a large, substantial fraction of pregnant women are exposed to intimate partner violence. And so one of the things that we think we should prioritize in this study is to try to contribute to a better understanding of how the pregnant woman's exposure to intimate partner violence affects her own well-being and then affects the well-being of the child. And so what we're interested in this study is to try and better understand the mediating pathways between maternal exposure to violence and child outcomes at age 6 months. So I'll finish here the long-term vision that we have with this new study. So as Lorraine said, I'm not planning to retire anytime soon. So how do we want to try and contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals with this study? First of all, we think that such a global birth cohort study focused around topics that are relevant for criminologists, that help us better understand child psychosocial health, could be an important resource for interdisciplinary developmental work on child well-being in the early 21st century. That includes criminology, but my understanding always has been that criminology should think of itself as just one subdiscipline that's interested in harm against human beings and the conditions under which human beings do well and live peacefully together. We want to link this to a policy impact strategy in collaboration with international organizations and city authorities to make a major contribution to achieving these sustainable development goals. For example, we're thinking about these cities as what we call pathfinder cities. So we want to work with the mayors in these cities to say, well, these are strategies that could also work in other cities in your countries. We want to integrate a capacity building approach that promotes young scholars and promotes South-South collaboration. And then, that's one of the big nightmares. We want to be one of the big challenges as well, to develop an organizational structure with a strong role of all study sites coordinated by the University of Cambridge through an interdisciplinary team. So that's not really a contribution to the... Sorry, this shouldn't be here because it's not really a contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's really primarily a contribution to trying to make sure that this study is going to actually function and as a very complex research enterprise. So that's my plan. So I've moved now to plans for the future, the plans for what I will be doing in the next few years. Thank you very much.